Snow drifted across the courtyard of the rural police station in central Germany. Thin snow, relentless snow. Snow that hid the cracks in the ground, but not the cracks in the regime that built the station. It settled on broken bicycles, on piles of confiscated coats, on the bare branches of the trees that leaned toward the old stone wall. It settled on the shoulders of 5 American prisoners being marched into the building. Their hands were bound behind their backs. Their heads were lowered. Their steps were slow because they had run out of other paces. A Gestapo officer walked ahead of them. He did not check whether they followed. He assumed they would. He had seen enough prisoners to know when a group had reached the quiet part of fear, the part where resistance becomes a calculation, not a reflex. He opened the door and motioned them inside. The Americans entered a hallway that smelled of old coal, wet wool, and disinfectant. A guard slammed the door behind them. Another guard pointed toward a narrow room with a single lamp hanging from a cable. They were told to sit. They obeyed. The room was not empty. A table, a thin stove, 2 chairs, and an empty blackboard. A bucket. A map of Germany with red pins marking air raids and blue pins marking arrests. It was mid-February, 1945. The pins had become too many to count. The guards did not speak to the prisoners. They spoke to each other. They spoke about rations, about rumors, about the Russians, about the Americans crossing the Rhine. They did not ask the prisoners their names. They already had names typed on a sheet. A door opened. A new figure entered the room. Not a Gestapo man. His coat was a different shade of gray. His collar tabs were different. His boots were polished, but not new. He carried a leather dispatch folder under one arm. He glanced at the prisoners, then at the guards. "Oberleutnant Karl Riedl," he said quietly. "From Berlin." The guards exchanged a look. They did not salute. They did not question him. They recognized the insignia of the Abwehr. The military intelligence service that had once been powerful, then weakened, then shattered by internal purges. Some pieces still moved. Some pieces still carried authority. Some pieces were more dangerous than the Gestapo because their motives were harder to read. Riedl set the folder on the table. He opened it. He produced an order stamped with the seal of an office the guards did not know personally but had heard enough about to fear. The order was simple. The prisoners were to be transferred immediately for intelligence purposes. Any delay would be considered obstruction. The word obstruction carried weight. In the last months of the war, it could mean anything. It could mean reassignment. It could mean dismissal. It could mean a bullet, depending on who was present to interpret the word. The senior guard hesitated, only for a moment. Then he nodded. He ordered the other guards to bring the prisoners. Riedl supervised the removal of their restraints. He handed each prisoner a thin coat. He said nothing until they stepped outside. "Walk," he said. "Stay close. Not too close." The prisoners followed him across the courtyard and through a gate that someone had forgotten to lock. A truck idled nearby. Not a Gestapo truck. A supply truck with mud frozen on the fenders. Riedl climbed into the passenger seat. He motioned for the prisoners to get into the back. The driver did not turn around. He looked ahead, hands gripping the wheel. When Riedl tapped the dashboard, the truck lurched forward. Snow thickened. Fields stretched out on either side of the road. Occasional farmhouses stood dark. The truck's engine echoed across the empty countryside. The prisoners shivered under thin coats. None of them spoke. They watched Riedl through the opening between the front cabin and the cargo bed. He scanned the horizon, checked his watch, and occasionally adjusted the map wedged between his knee and the door. An hour passed. The driver slowed. He turned down a forest road. The trees closed around them. The truck rolled to a stop in a clearing. Riedl got out. "We walk from here," he said. The driver pulled away without a word. The engine faded into the woods. The clearing became silent. Riedl faced the prisoners. He studied them as if confirming they were still intact. Then he said in unbroken English, "You will follow exactly. You will speak only if I ask." He led them into the woods, branches cracked underfoot. Snow dripped from the pines. The sky dimmed as thick clouds moved overhead. After half an hour, a patrol appeared on a ridge. 8 soldiers, 2 dogs. Riedl motioned the Americans down. They lay in the snow, breath controlled, eyes fixed on the ground. The patrol walked past, boots sinking into the slush. One dog paused. It sniffed the air. Riedl pressed a handful of crushed pine needles into the snow in front of the dog's path. The scent drifted. The dog turned and followed the soldiers. When the sound of boots faded, the Americans looked at him. He did not explain. He simply stood and kept walking. At dusk, they reached an abandoned logging hut. The roof sagged. The windows were broken. Inside, Riedl started a small fire with pieces of dry bark and a single match. He rationed the flame carefully. Enough to warm fingers, not enough to signal. The Americans finally asked the question that had been building since the station. "Why are you helping us?" Riedl stared at the fire as if the answer lived somewhere inside it. "Because you were going to die tonight," he said. "And because I have seen enough dying." It was not a confession, not an apology, not an ideology, just a statement. The prisoners ate what he handed them: dark bread, a small tin of cheese, a flask of water. Riedl ate nothing. When night deepened, he spoke again. "Listen, the Gestapo will discover the transfer was false. They will assume you escaped. They will search every road. We cannot use roads. We cross forest and river. You will be cold. You will want to stop. Do not." They slept in short intervals. Riedl stayed awake. He sat near the door, listening to the distant hum of engines that never came close. At dawn, they moved again. Snow had stopped. Frost covered the branches in pale crystals. Riedl walked at a steady pace, not fast, sustainable, measured. The pace of someone who has carried messages through dangerous ground before. By midday, they reached a partially frozen river. The current moved in dark lines beneath thin ice. Riedl tested the surface with his boot. The ice cracked. He pulled back. "We cross here," he said, "one at a time." He removed his coat, wrapped it around his chest, and stepped into the water. It rose to his knees, then to his waist, then to his ribs. He moved steadily, resisting the current. When he reached the far bank, he signaled the first prisoner. The Americans crossed one by one. The last man slipped. The ice shattered. He went under. Riedl moved fast, sliding down the bank, grabbing the man's arm, hauling him out. They collapsed in the snow. The man coughed water. Riedl rubbed his back until the coughing stopped. They continued. By late afternoon, the sound of artillery thumped faintly across the landscape. Each blast carried a direction. Riedl listened, judged distance, corrected course. The Americans trusted his adjustments without question. At sunset, they reached a farming village where all houses were dark. Smoke still rose from one chimney. Riedl approached the door and knocked once. An elderly farmer opened it. He looked at the uniforms. He glanced up the road. He stepped aside. No words were exchanged. The farmer's wife served hot water with herbs. She watched them calmly. Her silence was practiced, not fearful. Before they left, Riedl placed a ring on the table, a simple metal ring. The farmer tried to return it. Riedl closed the man's hand around it and nodded once. They left the village and walked through open fields. The sky cleared. The stars gave enough light to see the outline of distant hills. On one ridge, a German anti-aircraft gun crew loaded shells. Riedl moved the group into a drainage ditch until the crew finished. The shells arced into the night, bright streaks burning across the sky. When the gun fell silent, they continued. Around midnight, they reached the outskirts of a forest where Riedl stopped. He pointed toward a valley. 2 kilometers, American artillery positions. They fire at fixed intervals. Do not cross during firing. He studied each prisoner's face, the fatigue, the fear, the calculation. Then he said the words they already suspected were coming. "This is where we separate." Dalton, the ranking American, shook his head. "Come with us. You saved us." Riedl lowered his voice. If their sentries see my uniform, they will shoot. If they capture me, they will interrogate me. That puts you at risk. Their system has rules. My presence breaks those rules." One of the younger prisoners asked, "What happens to you if you stay?" Riedl looked toward the forest behind him, toward the regime, collapsing in its final, violent spasms. "It does not matter," he said. Dalton stepped forward, hand extended. Riedl shook it once, firmly, like a man acknowledging the completion of a task. No sentiment. Only closure. "Follow the valley," he said. "Hands high before you speak. Go." The Americans went. They crossed the valley in darkness. Artillery boomed at intervals, lighting the sky in white pulses. When they finally reached the American line, a machine gun snapped to readiness. Dalton shouted his name, his rank, his unit. Medics rushed forward. Blankets were draped over them. Hot drinks were pressed into their hands. They were alive. "Any Germans with you?" an officer asked. Dalton hesitated. "No," he said. Behind them, the forest absorbed the silence. In the weeks following their rescue, investigators examined the circumstances. They found the abandoned police station. They found forged transfer papers. They found a car believed to have been used by an Abwehr officer. They found nothing else. No body, no trial record, no grave. Later archives revealed fragments. A reference to an Abwehr officer arrested by the Gestapo in late March. A note about suspected collaboration. No follow-up document. The trail ended abruptly. Riedl vanished into the chaos of a nation collapsing under its own weight. The 5 Americans gave testimony. They described a quiet man in a gray coat, a map covered in pencil marks, a pace set by necessity, not fear. A man who never explained his motives because explanation was a luxury the situation did not afford. Their accounts raised questions that historians still debate. Why would a German intelligence officer risk everything to save enemy prisoners in the final months of the war? Was he acting on conscience? On personal disillusionment? On a calculated judgment that the future would not belong to the men hunting those prisoners? The answers remain uncertain. The evidence remains partial. The story remains incomplete because wars break not only nations but also the records of those nations. What survives are actions, choices, the consequences of those choices. The event revealed something fundamental. Technological systems fail. Command structures fail. Ideologies fail. In the ruins of failing systems, individual decisions emerge with disproportionate weight. A forged paper, a quiet voice, a hand cutting a wire, a man stepping into a river to save someone he had no obligation to protect. War is measured in divisions, tonnage, sorties, supply chains. But sometimes history pivots on one man walking into a room with a folder and a plan he never writes down. The 5 Americans returned home. They lived long enough to tell the story. Riedl left no record of his own, no medals, no files, only a void where his intentions should have been. History remembers nations for their victories. It remembers armies for their battles. But it remembers individuals for the moments when they choose against the tide. Karl Riedl chose. And 5 men lived because of it.